"You just broke the only thing that helps me see," the woman said softly, and for a moment, the entire street forgot how to move. The sound had come first, a sharp crack that didn't belong to the rhythm of a normal morning, not to the hum of passing cars or the distant hiss of a city bus pulling to a stop, but something smaller, closer, final, like a line being crossed that couldn't be uncrossed, and then silence followed, not complete, but heavy enough that conversations thinned and footsteps slowed, and in the center of it stood Naomi Walker, her posture straight but still, her hand hovering in the empty space where her cane had been seconds before, sunlight washing over her face in a soft, indifferent glow as if the world hadn't just shifted beneath her feet. Officer Ethan Cole stood across from her, one hand still loosely holding the broken half of the white cane, the other resting near his belt, his expression set in that practiced neutrality that came from years of wearing authority like armor, his uniform crisp in the early light, badge catching the sun just enough to flash when he moved, though now he didn't move much at all, just enough to glance down at the pieces in his hand before letting one half drop to the pavement where it rolled once, twice, then stopped against the edge of the curb. Around them, the city hesitated. A man in a business suit paused mid-step with his coffee halfway to his mouth. A woman holding a child's hand tightened her grip without realizing it. A delivery truck idled at the corner with its engine humming low, and somewhere behind the glass of a nearby cafe, someone pressed a phone to the window, recording without thinking about why. Naomi didn't reach down for the broken cane, didn't bend or flinch or raise her voice. She just stood there with her chin slightly lifted, her dark glasses reflecting nothing but light, her fingers slowly curling inward as if memorizing the absence. And when she spoke again, her voice carried not with volume, but with clarity, steady and calm in a way that didn't match the moment. "Officer, can you tell me where the curb is now?" The question landed differently than anyone expected, not defensive, not angry, just precise, and Ethan shifted his weight, just slightly, the smallest adjustment that most people wouldn't notice, but it was there, a flicker of something beneath the surface, something he quickly covered with a short exhale. "You shouldn't be standing in the middle of a sidewalk like this," he replied, his tone controlled, clipped, as if the situation were routine, as if the broken cane at his feet were just another object misplaced, not a lifeline snapped in half. And he gestured vaguely toward the edge of the street, though Naomi didn't turn, didn't follow the motion, because she couldn't see it, and maybe because she wasn't going to pretend she could. A faint breeze moved through the block, lifting the edge of her coat just enough to reveal the careful way she had positioned herself before everything changed, the quiet independence in how she stood alone in a place that wasn't designed for her. And for a second, a child's voice cut through the stillness, soft and unsure. "Mom, why did he do that?" The question hung there, unanswered, heavier than the silence before it, and Ethan's jaw tightened, just enough to show he heard it, though he didn't look toward the source. Naomi's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement of the moment, of the question, of the weight of it, and she slowly lowered her hand to her side, fingertips brushing the air where the cane should have been, then resting against the seam of her coat. "I was just trying to cross," she added quietly, not to argue, not to defend, just to state something simple and true, and the simplicity of it made the scene feel even sharper, more defined, like light hitting glass at the right angle. Ethan glanced down again, this time at the broken piece near his boot, and for the briefest moment, something in his posture shifted, a tension that didn't belong to authority but to uncertainty, though it vanished almost as quickly as it came, replaced by the same rigid stance, the same controlled presence. The city began to move again, slowly at first, footsteps resuming, voices returning in low murmurs, the bus pulling away with a long sigh of air brakes. But the space around Naomi remained different, like the moment had carved out its own boundary that no one was quite ready to step into. She stood there, in the middle of a bright American morning, without the one thing that helped her navigate it, and somehow, she looked steadier than anyone else on the sidewalk, as if the ground hadn't disappeared beneath her at all, as if it had simply revealed something deeper that the rest of them hadn't seen yet. The broken half of the cane rested against the edge of the curb, its white surface catching the sunlight in a way that made it look almost untouched, almost whole, If you did not notice the jagged split running through its center, and Naomi Walker tilted her head slightly, as if listening for something beyond the noise of the street, her breathing slow and measured while the world around her tried to decide whether to step forward or step away. And then, without warning, a small hand slipped into hers, warm and uncertain, fingers barely wrapping around her palm, but steady enough to be felt, and a quiet voice followed, soft but clear. "Miss, the curb is right in front of you." And Naomi's lips parted just enough for a breath that sounded like relief held tightly in place. "Thank you," she said, her voice gentle, her hand giving the smallest reassuring squeeze before releasing. And the child stepped back quickly as if unsure whether she had done too much or not enough, retreating to the side where her mother now stood watching, eyes flicking between Naomi and the officer with attention she did not try to hide. Ethan Cole noticed the exchange, of course he did, his gaze dropping to their hands and then lifting again, but he said nothing, only shifted his stance again, a fraction of an inch, the kind of movement that suggested discomfort rather than authority, though his expression remained fixed, controlled, unwilling to bend in front of the growing attention, and the murmurs around them began to take shape now. No longer just background noise, but fragments of judgment, whispers layered with disbelief. A few voices low and cautious, others sharper, edged with something closer to challenge, and somewhere behind him, a phone camera adjusted angle, zooming in just enough to catch his badge number glinting in the morning light. Naomi did not turn toward any of it, did not acknowledge the crowd or the shifting energy that had begun to gather like a storm just beyond reach. She simply adjusted her footing, placing one shoe carefully in front of the other, as if mapping out space through memory alone, her hand hovering again where the cane should have guided her, and for a moment, her balance wavered, just slightly, not enough to fall, but enough to reveal the cost of what had been taken, and then she steadied, shoulders easing back into alignment, her posture returning to something composed, something intentional, and in that stillness, she spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just present. "I would like to finish crossing now." And the sentence hung in the air like a request that was also a statement, a boundary drawn without force. Ethan exhaled through his nose, the sound almost lost beneath the hum of the city returning to motion, and he glanced down once more at the broken piece near his foot before nudging it slightly with the tip of his boot, not kicking it away, not moving it far, just enough to acknowledge its presence without fully engaging with it. And then he looked back at her, his voice coming out more measured this time, less clipped, though still guarded. "You should wait until someone can assist you. Properly." And the word properly lingered, as if it carried more weight than the rest, as if it tried to justify something that no longer felt as solid as it had a minute ago. Naomi's head tilted again, a small movement, thoughtful rather than reactive, and she let a second pass before answering. "I was assisting myself before, and there was no accusation in it, no raised tone, just a quiet fact that settled into the space between them, and something in the crowd shifted again, a ripple moving outward as more people began to notice not just what had happened, but how she was responding to it. The absence of anger, the absence of fear, replaced by something steadier, something harder to dismiss. A man near the back leaned closer to another, whispering a name under his breath, uncertain at first, then repeating it with more clarity. "Walker." And the word traveled, subtle but persistent, passed from one person to the next like a question that had not yet found its answer. And Ethan heard it too, not the first time, but this time it caught differently, not just as a name, but as something that seemed to carry recognition he could not immediately place, and his brow tightened just slightly, the smallest crease forming before he smoothed it away, his posture straightening again as if to reassert control over a moment that was no longer entirely his. Naomi remained where she was, one step from the curb, one step from the street, the sunlight warming her face as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had, and she did not rush, did not force the moment forward. She simply stood, waiting, not for permission, not for approval, but for the space to open again in a world that had briefly closed around her. And in that pause, something deeper began to shift, not just in the crowd, not just in the officer, but in the quiet, unfolding recognition that this moment was not going to end the way it began. The air did not return to normal. It only pretended to. The sound of traffic picking back up, footsteps resuming, conversations restarting in fragments. But underneath it all something stayed suspended, like a held breath that no one had released yet. And Naomi Walker stood exactly where she had been, one step from the curb, her head angled slightly toward the open street, as if she could feel the space in front of her shifting, measuring it without sight, mapping it through instinct and memory. While the broken pieces of her cane remained behind her, forgotten by no one but claimed by no one either. And then a new sound entered the moment, subtle at first, the low hum of an engine that did not match the rhythm of the passing cars, smoother, quieter, deliberate, and it slowed as it approached the edge of the block, tires rolling to a controlled stop just a few yards away from where the small crowd had gathered. A sleek black sedan idled at the curb, its windows tinted just enough to blur the outline of whoever sat inside. And for a second, nothing happened. No door opening, no voice calling out. Just the quiet presence of something that did not belong to the ordinary flow of the morning. And the crowd noticed, of course they did, heads turning slightly, eyes flicking toward it with curiosity that quickly mixed with something else, recognition that had not yet fully formed, and Ethan Cole noticed it too, his posture tightening almost imperceptibly, his gaze shifting from Naomi to the vehicle and back again as if trying to calculate whether it mattered, whether it was connected, whether it changed anything about the situation unfolding in front of him. Naomi did not turn toward the car, did not acknowledge its arrival, her focus remaining forward, steady, her hand lifting once more into the empty space where her cane should have guided her, and for a brief second her fingers hovered, then lowered again as if she had decided something quietly, something internal, and she took a small step forward, cautious but deliberate, the toe of her shoe finding the edge of the curb exactly where the child had said it would be, and she paused there, balanced between sidewalk and street, between stillness and motion, and in that pause, a voice from the crowd rose just enough to carry, uncertain but clearer now. Walker. That is Naomi Walker. And the name landed differently this time. Not just a whisper passed between strangers, but a statement that began to take shape, to solidify, and a few more heads turned, a few more eyes narrowed as pieces began to connect, and Ethan heard it again, this time with enough clarity that it forced a reaction he could not fully hide, his brow tightening, his jaw setting as he searched his memory for the reason that name felt familiar, important, something tied to more than just the woman standing in front of him. The sedan door opened with a soft, controlled click, not loud enough to interrupt, but precise enough to be noticed, and a man stepped out, tall, composed, dressed in a dark suit that fit with the same quiet precision as the car he had arrived in, his movements unhurried, his expression unreadable from a distance. And he did not call out, did not rush forward, he simply closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment, taking in the scene, the crowd, the officer, the broken cane, and finally, Naomi, his gaze settling on her with a focus that did not need explanation. Ethan straightened fully now, instinct taking over as he registered the shift, the presence, the weight of someone who carried authority of a different kind, not worn on a uniform but embedded in posture, in stillness, in the way the space seemed to adjust around him without a single word being spoken. And for the first time since the moment began, Ethan's confidence did not feel complete. It faltered at the edges, subtle but real, like a crack forming beneath a surface that had seemed solid. Just moments before, Naomi remained unaware of the exact change, but not of the feeling, something in the air shifting, the quiet pressure of attention focusing more sharply, and she inhaled slowly, grounding herself, her voice coming again, steady as before. "Is it clear for me to step down?" she asked, not directing the question at anyone specific, just offering it to the space around her, and for a second, no one answered. The silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional, until the man by the sedan finally spoke, his voice calm, measured, carrying easily without being raised. "It is clear," he said, and there was something in the tone that settled the moment instantly, not forceful, not commanding, but certain, and Naomi nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and stepped down from the curb onto the street, her movement careful but confident, guided not by sight, but by trust in the voice that had answered her. And as she did, the entire dynamic shifted, Not abruptly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, like a scene turning on an axis that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to move. Naomi Walker's foot met the asphalt with quiet certainty, the texture of the street different from the smooth edge of the curb, warmer under the morning sun, and she paused there for just a fraction of a second, as if confirming the world had not shifted again beneath her, then continued forward with measured steps, each one placed with care, guided now by the memory of space and the steady presence of the voice that had answered her, while behind her the crowd seemed to lean in without moving, attention narrowing, conversations dissolving into silence once more as the man who had spoken began to walk, not quickly, not urgently, but with a calm that carried weight, closing the distance between himself and Naomi step by step, his shoes striking the pavement with a soft, even rhythm that contrasted with the tension still hanging in the air. Ethan Cole watched him approach, and something inside him adjusted again, a subtle recalibration that he could not fully control, his shoulders tightening, his stance shifting from casual authority to something more formal, more alert, though he had not been given any direct reason to change, not yet, and still, the presence of the man demanded it without asking, without announcing, simply by existing within the same space. Naomi continued forward until she reached the midpoint of the street, then slowed, sensing the shift around her, the quiet convergence of attention, and she stopped, her head turning slightly toward the sound of approaching footsteps, her expression composed, unguarded, as if she recognized the voice even before the man spoke again. "You are doing just fine," he said, his tone steady, close now, close enough that the warmth of it seemed to settle the air around her, and Naomi's lips softened into the faintest hint of a smile, not wide, not dramatic, just enough to acknowledge something familiar, something grounding. "Thank you," she replied, her voice low but clear, and there was a pause that followed, not awkward, not uncertain, but full, as if the moment itself needed space to settle into what it was becoming. Behind them, the broken pieces of the cane remained where they had fallen, one half near the curb, the other slightly farther back on the sidewalk, both untouched, both visible, and the man's gaze shifted briefly toward them, not with surprise, not with confusion, but with recognition, a quiet understanding of what had happened without needing it explained, and when his eyes lifted again, they moved directly to Ethan. There was no rush in it, no aggression, just a deliberate shift of focus that carried more weight than any raised voice could have, and Ethan felt it immediately, the way the moment narrowed, the way the air seemed to press in slightly, and he straightened again, instinctively, his chin lifting just enough to maintain composure even as something beneath it began to give way. "Is there a problem here, officer?" the man asked, his voice even, measured, not loud but unmistakably clear, and the question did not sound like an accusation. Not yet. It sounded like an invitation for explanation, a chance to define the moment before it defined itself. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, then hesitated for a fraction of a second, the briefest pause that would have gone unnoticed in any other situation but here. Now, it mattered, and when he did speak, his tone was controlled, professional, but no longer entirely certain. "Just handling a situation," he said, the words familiar, rehearsed, but lacking the same solidity they might have carried before. And the man nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the answer without fully accepting it. Naomi remained still between them, her presence quiet but central, not stepping back, not stepping aside, simply existing within the space that had formed, and she turned her head slightly toward the man, her voice softer now, more personal. "I was crossing," she said, and there was no need to say more, no need to explain further, the simplicity of it carrying everything it needed to carry. The man's expression did not change dramatically, but something in his eyes sharpened, a focus that settled more firmly into place, and he glanced once more toward the broken cane before returning his attention to Ethan, the connection now unmistakable, the context complete. Around them, the crowd had fully stilled again, phones held steady, breaths quiet, the entire block caught in the slow unfolding of something that was no longer just an isolated moment, but something larger, something that extended beyond the street, beyond the morning, into a space where actions carried consequences that could not be undone, and Ethan felt it, not as a sudden realization, but as a gradual shift, a pressure building at the edges of his certainty. And for the first time since the crack of the cane had cut through the morning, he did not feel entirely in control of what would happen next. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling into the space between them like something that demanded to be acknowledged, and Ethan Cole felt it pressing against his chest, subtle but persistent, as the man's gaze held steady on him. Not hostile, not raised, just unwavering in a way that made it difficult to look away. And for a brief second, Ethan glanced past him, toward the black sedan, toward the small cluster of people now watching more closely than before, phones lifted, faces intent, and then back again, as if searching for something familiar, something that would give him footing in a moment that no longer felt routine. Naomi Walker stood between them, her posture unchanged, her presence calm in a way that seemed almost out of place in the tension that surrounded her, and she turned her head slightly toward the man, her voice softer now, quieter, but carrying clearly enough to reach him. "It is just a street, but it feels longer today," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that shifted the weight of the moment again, not toward confrontation, but toward something more human, something that could not be dismissed as easily as procedure or protocol. The man's expression softened just slightly, not in weakness, but in recognition, and he took one more step closer to her, positioning himself not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her, aligning his presence with hers rather than over it. And when he spoke again, his tone carried the same calm certainty. "You are not alone on it," he said, and Naomi nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, her fingers relaxing at her side, as if that single sentence had restored something invisible, but essential. Behind them, the broken cane remained in two separate pieces, and the longer half shifted slightly as a faint breeze moved across the sidewalk, rolling it an inch closer to the curb before stopping again, and the movement drew a few eyes back to it, reminding everyone of what had happened, of what had been taken, and Ethan noticed that too, his gaze flicking down briefly before returning to the man. And this time, something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for most to see, but enough that it altered the way he stood, the way he held his shoulders, the way his certainty no longer felt complete. "Sir," Ethan began, his voice more formal now, more careful. There was a concern about pedestrian safety, and the words came out slower, measured, as if he were choosing them with more intention than before, and the man listened without interrupting, his head tilting just slightly, as if considering the explanation. And when Ethan finished, there was a pause, a quiet space where the answer could settle or fall apart. And the man's eyes shifted briefly to the broken cane again, then back to Ethan. "And how does that concern resolve itself when the tool that ensures her safety is no longer intact?" he asked, his tone unchanged, still calm, still even, but carrying a precision that made the question land harder than any raised voice could have. And Ethan did not respond immediately, the answer not forming as quickly as it might have before, and the pause stretched just long enough to be felt by everyone watching, just long enough for the question to echo in the space between them. Naomi remained still, her head angled slightly toward the sound of their voices, listening, not interrupting, not stepping away, simply present. And after a moment, she spoke again, her voice gentle, almost quiet enough to be missed. "Officer, I did not need to be stopped," she said, and there was no accusation in it, no edge, just a simple truth offered without force, and it shifted something again, not just in the crowd, not just in the man beside her, but in Ethan himself, who felt the words settled differently than anything else that had been said, not as a challenge, but as something harder to defend against because it carried no hostility. The murmurs around them had faded completely now, replaced by a stillness that felt intentional, expectant, and Ethan inhaled slowly, his gaze dropping once more to the broken cane, then lifting again, and for the first time since the moment had begun, his voice when he spoke carried a trace of something else, something quieter, less rigid. "I may have misjudged the situation," he said, the words careful, deliberate, and the admission, though small, shifted the balance of the moment in a way that no command could have, and the man beside Naomi watched him for a second longer before giving a single, almost imperceptible nod, not approval, not dismissal, just acknowledgement, and the morning light continued to spill across the street, unchanged, indifferent, illuminating all of it with the same steady brightness, as if the world itself were bearing witness without taking sides. The admission did not echo loudly, but it settled into the moment with a weight that could not be ignored, and for a second, the city seemed to pause again, not out of shock this time, but out of recognition, as if something had shifted just enough to change the direction of what came next, and Naomi Walker stood quietly between them, her head angled slightly downward now, listening not just to the words, but to the space around them. The subtle change in tone, the way the air felt less rigid, less closed, and she exhaled slowly, a breath that carried more than relief, something steadier, something grounded. The man beside her did not respond immediately to Ethan Cole's statement. He simply observed, his gaze steady, thoughtful, as if weighing not just the words, but the intent behind them, and after a moment, he turned slightly, his attention shifting from the officer to the ground behind them, where the broken cane still lay in two separate pieces, and he stepped back a single pace, bending just enough to reach for the longer half. His movement controlled, deliberate, as though even this simple action carried meaning, and when he straightened again, the cane rested lightly in his hand, its fractured edge visible in the sunlight, undeniable, and he held it there for a second, not presenting it, not pointing it out, just allowing it to exist within the space as it was, a quiet reminder of what had already happened. Naomi tilted her head slightly toward the faint shift in air as he moved, sensing rather than seeing, and her fingers lifted a fraction, almost instinctively, before settling again, and she spoke softly. "Is that it?" And the question was simple, but it carried a subtle weight, not just about the cane, but about everything that had unfolded, and the man answered just as simply, "Part of it," he said, his tone calm, and there was something in that exchange that grounded the moment further, bringing it away from tension and closer to truth. Ethan watched this unfold, his eyes following the movement of the cane, the way it was held, the way it was not dismissed or ignored, and something in his posture shifted again, not outwardly dramatic, but enough that the rigidity he had carried at the beginning of the encounter no longer fit the same way, and he cleared his throat slightly, the sound small but noticeable in the quiet. "I can call for assistance," he said, the offer measured, careful, as if testing the space for how it would be received, and Naomi turned her head slightly toward him, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "I was not waiting for assistance," she replied, and there was no resistance in her tone, no rejection, just a quiet correction, a reminder of something that had been true before the moment began. The crowd remained still, but their presence had shifted, no longer just observers of a conflict, but witnesses to something more layered, something that was unfolding slowly, piece by piece, and a few of them lowered their phones without realizing it, as if the moment no longer needed to be captured to be understood, and the man beside Naomi took a step closer again, positioning himself just slightly ahead of her now, not blocking her path, but aligning with it, and he extended the broken cane forward, not toward Ethan, but toward the space between them, as if offering it back to the moment itself. "What she needs is not complicated," he said, his voice even, clear. "It is respect," and the words settled into the air differently than anything before it, not as a demand, not as a reprimand, but as a statement that did not require elevation to carry weight. Ethan inhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly before lifting again, and this time, when he looked at Naomi, it was not through the same lens as before. Something had shifted, not entirely, not completely resolved, but enough to be felt, and he nodded once, a small, contained movement. "Understood," he said, the word quiet but deliberate, and for a second, the tension that had defined the moment from the beginning eased just slightly, not disappearing, but loosening its hold. Naomi remained where she was, her posture steady, her presence calm, and after a moment, she extended her hand forward, not searching blindly, but with quiet confidence, trusting the space, trusting the shift that had taken place, and the man gently guided the unbroken portion of the cane toward her fingers, careful, precise, allowing her to take hold of it on her own terms, and when her hand closed around it, there was a subtle change in the way she stood, a small adjustment, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal that something had been restored, not fully, not completely, but enough to continue, and the morning light remained constant, illuminating the scene without judgment. As the moment moved forward into something quieter, something more human, something that could not be undone, but could still be understood. Naomi Walker's fingers closed around the remaining length of the cane, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fall into the background. The murmurs, the traffic, even the presence of the people around her, as if the simple act of holding something familiar again had drawn a quiet boundary between her and the rest of the world, and she adjusted her grip slightly, testing the balance, the weight, the way it responded to her touch. And though it was no longer whole, it was still something she could use, still something she could rely on, at least for now. And that alone shifted her posture just enough to be seen, her shoulders settling, her stance grounding in a way that had been missing since the moment the cane had first left her hand. The man beside her watched this small adjustment with careful attention, not stepping in further, not interrupting, simply allowing her to reclaim what she could on her own terms. And then his gaze lifted again, returning to Ethan Cole, who remained standing where he was, no longer rigid, no longer fully certain, but still present, still part of the moment that had not yet fully resolved. A faint breeze moved through the street again, carrying with it the distant sound of a horn, the low rumble of an engine starting somewhere down the block, and the city seemed ready to continue, to move on. But something in the space between these three people held it just a little longer, as if there was still something left unsaid, something that needed to settle before everything could truly return to normal. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her voice soft but clear as she spoke again. "It feels shorter now," she said, referring to the cane in her hand. But the words carried more than their surface meaning, and the man beside her nodded once, understanding without needing explanation. "Then we will take smaller steps," he replied, his tone steady, and there was a quiet reassurance in it that did not draw attention to itself, but remained present all the same. Ethan's gaze shifted between them, and for the first time since the encounter had begun, he seemed to hesitate not because he did not know what to do, but because he was beginning to understand that what he had done could not simply be undone with procedure, with a call, with a report, and that realization sat with him in a way that was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, but impossible to ignore. He took a small step forward, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to signal that he was still part of what was happening, and his voice, when he spoke again, carried a different weight, quieter, more measured. "I will make sure a replacement is arranged immediately," he said, the offer direct, practical, but lacking the defensiveness that had been there before, and Naomi turned her head slightly toward him, her expression unchanged, her voice calm. "That would help someone else," she said, and the sentence landed gently, not rejecting, not dismissing, but redirecting, as if she were speaking about something larger than herself, something beyond the moment. The man beside her glanced at her briefly, a subtle acknowledgement passing between them, and then he looked back at Ethan, his tone still even, still composed. "Accountability is not always about fixing what is broken," he said. "Sometimes it is about understanding why it was broken in the first place." And the words settled into the air with a clarity that did not need emphasis, and Ethan absorbed them in silence, his posture shifting again, not outwardly, but enough that it reflected something internal, something beginning to move beneath the surface. The crowd around them had grown quieter now, no longer murmuring, no longer reacting in small bursts, but simply watching, listening, as if the moment had become something more than an incident, something closer to a lesson unfolding in real time. And a few people began to lower their phones completely, their attention no longer divided between the screen and the scene, but fully present. Naomi adjusted her grip on the cane once more, then took a small step forward, testing the ground again, her movement careful but confident, and the man beside her mirrored her pace without overtaking it, staying close enough to be present, but not so close as to guide her without her asking. And together they began to move, slowly, across the remaining distance of the street. Ethan remained where he was for a second longer, watching them, the broken piece of the cane still near his foot, and he looked down at it again, this time not as an object to be ignored, but as something that carried weight, something that represented a moment he could not step away from so easily. And after a brief pause, he bent down, picking it up carefully, holding it in his hand as if unsure what to do with it next. And when he straightened again, his gaze followed Naomi and the man as they continued forward, the space between them widening with each step, and the morning light continued to stretch across the street, unchanged, steady, illuminating everything with the same quiet clarity as the moment moved, slowly but surely, toward whatever would come next. The distance across the street was not far, no more than 30 feet from curb to curb, but the way Naomi Walker moved made it feel measured, intentional, each step placed with a quiet awareness that turned space into something almost tangible, and the man beside her matched her pace without guiding it, his presence steady, close enough to be felt but never imposed, and together they moved through the last stretch of asphalt as the city slowly resumed its rhythm around them. Cars inching forward, pedestrians shifting their weight, conversations beginning again in softer tones, as if the moment they had just witnessed had left something behind that could not be fully spoken. Naomi reached the opposite curb and paused, her cane tapping lightly once, twice, testing the edge before stepping up onto the sidewalk. And when her foot found solid ground again, there was a subtle release in her posture, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to signal that she had completed something more than just a crossing, something that had required more than balance, more than direction, something that had asked for trust in a space that had not earned it moments before. The man stopped beside her, turning slightly toward her, his voice low but clear. "You handled that with more grace than most people ever learn," he said, and Naomi's lips curved into the faintest smile again, not out of pride, but out of recognition. "Grace is quieter than anger," she replied, her tone calm, and the simplicity of it carried a weight that lingered in the air between them. Behind them, on the other side of the street, Ethan Cole still stood near the curb, the broken piece of the cane in his hand, his gaze fixed in their direction, not following, not approaching, just watching, and something in the way he stood had changed. The rigid posture softened, the certainty replaced by something more reflective, something unsettled, and he turned the fragment of the cane slightly in his hand, examining the uneven edge where it had split, as if trying to understand it. Beyond its surface, beyond the material, as if it represented something he had not fully grasped until now. A passing car honked lightly, pulling his attention back for a moment, and when he looked up again, Naomi and the man had already begun to move along the sidewalk, their figures blending gradually into the flow of the morning, not disappearing, but no longer the center of it, and the space they had occupied began to close behind them, filled in by the ordinary movement of the city returning to itself. Naomi adjusted her grip on the shortened cane once more, her fingers finding a new balance point, and she continued forward with steady steps, the sound of the cane against the pavement lighter now, different, but still rhythmic, still reliable, and after a few moments, she spoke again, her voice softer, more reflective. "You did not have to come," she said, and the man beside her glanced at her briefly before looking ahead again. "I did not come," he replied. "I arrived when I was needed," and there was something in that distinction that settled into the moment with quiet clarity. Naomi nodded slightly, absorbing the words, and they continued walking side by side, not speaking for a few seconds, allowing the rhythm of their steps to fill the space instead, and the sounds of the city wrapped around them once more, less intrusive now, more familiar, like a background that had returned to its place after briefly stepping forward. On the other side of the street, Ethan finally moved, taking a slow step back from the curb, then another, his eyes still tracking the direction they had gone, and he looked down again at the broken piece in his hand, then across at the empty space where the other half had once rested, and something in his expression shifted further, not just uncertainty now, but recognition, the kind that does not come all at once, but settles in gradually, piece by piece, until it can no longer be ignored. He exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the noise around him, and for a moment, he considered crossing the street, closing the distance, saying something more, but his feet did not move, not yet, and instead he remained where he was, holding the fragment, standing in the place where the moment had begun, as if understanding that whatever came next would not be resolved by a single step, but by something deeper, something that would take longer than the space of a morning to fully unfold. And as the sunlight continued to stretch across the city, casting long, quiet reflections along the glass and pavement. The moment did not end. It simply shifted, moving forward into a space where its meaning would continue to grow, long after the street itself had forgotten the sound that had first brought everything to a stop. Naomi Walker continued along the sidewalk, the rhythm of her shortened cane tapping lightly against the concrete, each contact producing a softer sound than before, but still steady, still precise. And the man beside her remained just within reach, his presence calm, unhurried, allowing her to lead without interruption. And for a few moments neither of them spoke, the silence between them not empty, but full, shaped by everything that had already passed and everything that had yet to be. Understood. The morning carried on around them, footsteps blending into a low current of movement, voices rising and falling in casual conversation, the scent of coffee drifting from a nearby cafe as a door opened and closed. And somewhere down the block a delivery cart rattled over uneven pavement, its wheels echoing briefly before fading again, and Naomi adjusted her pace slightly, aligning herself with the familiar patterns of sound that helped her navigate, her posture composed, her expression calm, as if the earlier moment had settled into something internal, something she was carrying without needing to display. After a few more steps, she spoke again, her voice quiet but clear. "You always wait until the moment becomes visible to others," she said, not as a question, but as an observation, and the man beside her let out a faint breath that almost resembled a smile, though it did not fully form. "Visibility changes what people are willing to admit," he replied, his tone even, and there was something in that sentence that carried weight beyond the street, beyond the morning, something tied to a larger understanding that did not need to be explained in full. Naomi nodded slightly, absorbing the words, and her fingers tightened just a fraction around the cane, as if grounding herself in the present, and then she slowed her pace, stopping near the edge of a storefront where the shade from an overhang softened the sunlight, and she turned her head slightly toward him. "You did not say your name," she said, her tone gentle, and the man paused, just briefly, as if considering the question, not because he did not have an answer, but because the answer carried its own weight, its own implications, and for a moment, the sounds of the city seemed to recede again, not completely, but enough to make space for what he would say next. "James Walker," he replied, his voice steady, and the name settled into the air with a quiet finality, not announced, not emphasized, but unmistakable, and Naomi's expression shifted just slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, as if something unspoken had just been confirmed rather than revealed, and she exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing just a fraction. "You came anyway," she said softly, and James did not respond immediately, his gaze lifting briefly toward the street behind them, where the moment had unfolded, before returning to her. "Some things do not wait for permission," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more meaning than a longer explanation ever could. Across the street, Ethan Cole had not moved far, but he had not remained still either, his steps slow, measured, as he walked along the curb in the direction Naomi and James had gone, not closing the distance completely, but no longer standing rooted in place, and the broken fragment of the cane remained in his hand, its presence now constant, a reminder he could not set aside, and as he walked, he replayed the moment in fragments, the sound, the silence, the words that followed, each piece settling differently than it had before, forming a picture that no longer aligned with the version he had held at the beginning. A passing pedestrian glanced at him, then at the cane in his hand, then back again, recognition flickering briefly before the moment passed, and Ethan continued forward, his gaze lifting toward Naomi and James ahead, their figures now partially obscured by the flow of people moving along the sidewalk, and he slowed again, uncertainty returning, not about what had happened, but about what he should do next. And that uncertainty lingered, stretching out in the space between action and reflection. Naomi remained where she had stopped, her head slightly tilted, listening not just to James, but to the world around her, the subtle shifts in sound, the movement of people, the distant hum of traffic, and she spoke again, her voice softer now, more reflective. "It was not the cane," she said, and James turned slightly toward her, attentive. "It was the assumption behind it," she continued, and the words carried a quiet clarity that settled into the moment with precision, and James nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the truth in it without needing to add to it, and for a few seconds, neither of them spoke, allowing the weight of that statement to remain where it was. Ethan stopped a few yards behind them, close enough to hear, far enough not to interrupt, and the words reached him clearly, settling into his awareness in a way that the earlier moment had not. And he looked down at the fragment in his hand again, then back up, his expression shifting once more, not defensive, not rigid, but thoughtful, as if something deeper had finally begun to take shape. And the morning light continued to fall across the street, steady and unchanged, illuminating all of it. With the same quiet consistency, as the moment moved forward into something that no longer belonged to just one action, but to the understanding that followed it. The words did not fade after Naomi Walker spoke them. They lingered, settling into the space with a quiet permanence that made everything else feel secondary. And Ethan Cole stood there, a few yards behind, holding the broken fragment in his hand as if it carried more weight than it should, his grip neither tight nor loose, just uncertain. And for the first time since the morning had begun, he did not look at Naomi first. He looked at James Walker, really looked, not as a passerby, not as a concerned stranger, but as someone whose presence had shifted the entire direction of what had happened, and something in the recognition behind his eyes began to align, slow but undeniable. James did not rush the moment, did not fill the silence. He simply stood beside Naomi, his posture relaxed but grounded, his attention divided between her and the space around them, as if aware that what came next would not be shaped by urgency, but by clarity. And Naomi remained still, her head slightly lowered, her fingers resting lightly on the shortened cane, her breathing steady, as though she had already moved past the moment emotionally, even if the situation itself had not fully resolved. A car passed slowly behind them, its tires humming against the asphalt, and the sound seemed to draw Ethan forward, one step, then another, closing the distance he had hesitated to cross before, not with authority, not with certainty, but with something quieter, something closer to intention. And when he stopped again, he was no longer observing from afar. He was part of the space once more, though in a different way than before. "Ma'am," he said, his voice measured, but no longer guarded. And Naomi turned her head slightly toward him, her expression unchanged, her presence calm. And for a second, Ethan did not continue, the words catching not because he did not have them, but because he was beginning to understand that what he said now mattered in a way it had not earlier. "I should not have made that assumption," he said finally, each word deliberate, and the sentence did not sound like a defense, it sounded like an acknowledgement, and it settled into the moment with a quiet weight that matched the tone of everything that had come before it. Naomi did not respond immediately. She allowed the words to exist, to settle, and then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Assumptions are easy when you do not have to live with them," she said, and there was no accusation in it, just a truth offered plainly, and Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing it in a way that suggested he was not trying to counter it, not trying to move past it too quickly, but to understand it where it stood. James watched the exchange without interruption, his gaze moving between them, not controlling the moment, but ensuring it remained grounded, and after a few seconds, he spoke, his tone even. "Understanding begins when you stop explaining and start listening," he said, and the words did not come as instruction, but as observation. Something that had already begun to take place rather than something being demanded. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, and for the first time, there was no tension in the way he stood, no rigid line in his posture, just a presence that felt more aligned with the moment than opposed to it. And he looked at the fragment of the cane in his hand, then extended it forward, not abruptly, not forcefully, just offering it back into the space it belonged to. "This is the other part," he said quietly, and Naomi's hand lifted slightly, not searching, not uncertain, but aware, and James guided the angle just enough for her fingers to meet the edge, and when she touched it, there was a pause, a small stillness as she felt the break, the uneven line where it had split, and her fingers traced it once, lightly, before she withdrew her hand. "It is enough to know," she said, her voice calm, and the sentence seemed to close something, not the moment entirely, but a part of it that no longer needed to be revisited, and Ethan lowered his hand again, the fragment still with him, but no longer unacknowledged. The street continued to move around them, people passing, voices returning, the city reclaiming its rhythm, but something remained different, something quieter, more aware, as if the space itself had absorbed what had happened and would carry it forward in ways that were not immediately visible. And Naomi adjusted her grip on the shortened cane once more, then took a small step forward, her movement steady, intentional. And James matched her pace again, staying beside her without overtaking, without guiding unless needed, and together they began to move down the sidewalk once more. Ethan remained where he was for a second longer, watching them go, the fragment still in his hand, and he did not call out, did not try to stop them. He simply stood there, allowing the moment to settle fully, and when he finally turned away, it was not with the same certainty he had started the morning with, but with something quieter, something heavier, something that would stay with him long after the street had returned to normal. And as the sunlight continued to stretch across the buildings and pavement, the scene did not end. It shifted, carrying its meaning forward into whatever came next. Naomi Walker did not look back as she continued down the sidewalk, the soft, uneven tap of her shortened cane marking a new rhythm, not perfect, not what it had been before, but steady enough to carry her forward, and James Walker remained beside her, matching her pace with quiet precision, his presence unchanged, grounded, as if nothing about the moment behind them required urgency, only continuation, and the city began to fold back into itself around them, the earlier tension dissolving into the ordinary flow of footsteps, traffic, and distant voices. Yet something lingered beneath it all, something that could not be seen but could still be felt, like a shift in air pressure after a storm has passed. Naomi adjusted her grip slightly, her fingers finding a more comfortable hold on the shortened cane, and she exhaled slowly, not out of exhaustion, but as if releasing something she had chosen not to carry any further. And after a few steps, she spoke again, her voice low, reflective. "He listened," she said, not with surprise, but with quiet acknowledgement, and James glanced at her briefly before looking ahead again. "He began to," he replied, his tone calm, measured, and the distinction in his words settled gently into the space between them. Naomi nodded once, understanding the difference without needing it explained, and they continued walking in silence for a few moments, the sound of their steps blending into the rhythm of the street, until she spoke again. "Most do not," she added, and there was no bitterness in it, only truth, and James allowed a second to pass before responding. "Most are not given the moment that forces them to," he said, and the sentence carried a quiet weight, as if acknowledging both the rarity and the cost of such moments. A bus pulled to a stop at the corner ahead, its brakes releasing with a long, low sigh, and the sound seemed to anchor the scene back into the present, into the ordinary, and Naomi slowed slightly, adjusting her direction as she approached the edge of the bus stop area, her cane tapping lightly against the pavement, and she turned her head just enough to sense the change in space, the presence of others waiting nearby, their movements subtle but detectable, and she stepped to the side, allowing the flow of people to pass without interruption. Behind them, across the street and now partially out of view, Ethan Cole remained where he had paused after the exchange, the fragment of the cane still in his hand, and he had not moved for several seconds, not because he did not know how, but because the moment had not fully released him yet, and he looked down at the piece again, then up at the space where Naomi and James had disappeared into the movement of the city, and something in his expression shifted further, not just recognition now, but a quiet sense of responsibility that extended beyond the immediate, beyond the street, into something that would follow him after this morning ended. He took a slow breath, then another, and finally began to walk, not in pursuit, not to close the distance, but to move forward with the weight of what he now understood, his steps measured, deliberate, as if each one carried a new awareness he had not held before. Back on the sidewalk ahead, Naomi and James resumed their pace after the brief pause, moving past the bus stop and into a quieter stretch of the block where the sounds of the city softened slightly, and Naomi spoke again, her voice calm. "You did not raise your voice," she said, and James allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch his expression before it faded again. Volume is often mistaken for authority, he replied. But clarity lasts longer, and Naomi's lips curved slightly in response, a quiet acknowledgement of something she had already known in her own way. The sunlight filtered through the buildings above, casting long, soft reflections across the sidewalk, and as they moved through it, their shadows stretched briefly beside them before shifting again, and the moment behind them continued to settle, not disappearing, but transforming into something less immediate, more internal, something that would remain long after the street had returned to its usual pace. Naomi adjusted her grip once more, then took another steady step forward, her movement smooth, confident, and James remained beside her, not guiding, not leading, simply present, and together they continued down the block, leaving behind not just the place where everything had happened, but the version of that moment that had first begun with misunderstanding, carrying instead what it had become, something quieter, something deeper, something that did not need to be spoken aloud to remain real. The sidewalk stretched ahead in a long, steady line, the kind that most people never thought about. But for Naomi Walker, it was something she measured with every step, every sound, every subtle shift in air and space, and the shortened cane in her hand tapped lightly against the pavement, its rhythm adjusted but not broken, a quiet adaptation that mirrored something deeper within her, and James Walker remained beside her, his pace aligned with hers, his presence unchanged, steady and calm, as if the morning had simply unfolded exactly as it was meant to, not rushed, not forced, but revealed. The sounds of the city softened slightly as they moved farther from the intersection, replaced by a quieter pattern of footsteps, distant traffic, and the occasional murmur of conversation, and Naomi slowed her pace just enough to register the change, her head tilting slightly as she listened, her awareness extending outward in a way that required no sight, only attention, and after a moment, she spoke again, her voice low but clear. "It feels different here," she said, and James nodded once. Even though she could not see it, his response carried in his tone, "Less crowded," he replied, "less noise," and Naomi allowed a small pause before responding. "Less pressure," she added, and the words settled into the space between them with quiet precision, as if it described more than just the environment around them. They continued walking, their steps unhurried, and after a few seconds, Naomi adjusted her grip again, her fingers shifting along the cane as if memorizing its new shape, its altered balance, and she stopped briefly, not because she needed to, but because she chose to, her posture still composed, her presence grounded, and she turned her head slightly toward James. "You did not tell him," she said, and the statement was calm, not questioning, not accusing, just observant, and James understood immediately what she meant, what she had chosen to leave unspoken, and he responded without hesitation. "It was not necessary," he said, his tone even, and Naomi's lips curved faintly again, a quiet acknowledgement that did not need further explanation. Behind them, farther back along the block, Ethan Cole had reached the edge of the quieter stretch, his steps slower now, more deliberate, and he stopped once more, not because he had lost sight of them entirely, but because something in him had decided not to follow any closer, and he looked down again at the fragment in his hand, then at the sidewalk ahead, and for the first time, the question in his mind was not about what had happened, but about what it meant, not just for Naomi, but for him, for the way he saw, the way he acted, the way he assumed, and the realization did not come as a sudden clarity, but as a gradual unfolding, something that would take time to fully understand, and he exhaled slowly, the breath steady, as if accepting that process without resistance. Back ahead, Naomi resumed her steps, the cane tapping lightly once more, and after a few moments, she spoke again, her voice softer now, more reflective. "He wanted to fix it quickly," she said, referring to Ethan without naming him, and James glanced ahead, his expression calm. "Quick solutions are easier than lasting understanding," he replied, and Naomi nodded slightly, absorbing the distinction, and they continued walking side by side, their movement steady, unbroken. The sunlight shifted as they moved past another row of buildings, casting longer shadows across the pavement, and Naomi's steps remained sure, her pace consistent, and after a few seconds, she added, "You let him stay in the moment," and James allowed a brief pause before answering. That is where change begins, he said, and the words carried a quiet weight, not dramatic, not emphasized, but grounded in something that extended beyond the morning, beyond the street. Naomi adjusted her grip once more, then slowed again slightly, her head tilting as if sensing the space ahead opening into something wider, and she spoke one more time, her voice calm, certain. He will remember this, she said, and James nodded once, his tone steady. So will you, he replied, and Naomi's expression remained composed, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a quiet strength that seemed more defined now, more settled, and after a moment, she took another step forward, continuing along the path ahead. Her movement smooth, confident, and James remained beside her, not guiding, not leading, simply present, as the morning carried on around them, unchanged in appearance, but altered in meaning, the moment behind them no longer just an event, but something that had taken root, something that would continue to grow long after the street itself had returned to its ordinary rhythm. The sidewalk continued forward in a quiet, uninterrupted line, stretching beyond the reach of the morning's earlier tension, and Naomi Walker walked it with a steady rhythm that no longer carried hesitation, her shortened cane tapping lightly against the pavement, each sound precise, intentional, a new pattern formed from what had been altered but not lost, and beside her, James Walker remained present in the same quiet way he had always been, not guiding, not correcting, simply there, aligned. With her pace, with her space, with her silence. The city had fully returned to itself now, the earlier moment dissolving into the background of passing cars, distant conversations, and the soft hum of a normal day resuming its course. Yet something remained beneath it all, something that could not be seen or heard directly, but existed in the space between memory and meaning, carried not by the street, but by the people who had stood within it. Naomi adjusted her grip slightly, her fingers settling more naturally along the cane as if her body had already begun to adapt to its new shape, and she slowed her pace just enough to register the subtle shift in the air ahead, the openness of the block, the way sound traveled differently, without the echo of tall buildings pressing in, and she spoke one last time, her voice calm, grounded. It is still enough, she said, not referring only to the cane, but to something larger, something internal, and James turned his head slightly toward her, his expression steady, his tone soft. It always was, he replied, and the words settled into the moment with quiet finality. They walked a few more steps together, their pace unbroken, until Naomi came to a natural pause, not forced, not hesitant, just a point where movement slowed into stillness, and she turned her head slightly, not toward him, not toward the street, but forward, as if acknowledging the path ahead in a way that required no sight, only certainty, and James stopped beside her, his presence unchanged, his silence now carrying everything that did not need to be said. Behind them, far enough to no longer be part of their immediate space, Ethan Cole had finally reached the edge of where the moment had once held him, and he stood there for a second longer, the broken fragment still in his hand, but no longer just an object, no longer just a reminder. It had become something else, something that marked a shift he could not ignore, and he looked down at it one last time before carefully placing it into his pocket, not discarding it, not leaving it behind, but choosing to carry it forward. And when he lifted his gaze again, Naomi and James were no longer within view, their presence absorbed into the city that had reclaimed them, and yet the space they had occupied did not feel empty, it felt changed. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing in a way that did not release the weight of the moment, but accepted it, and he turned, not back toward where he had been, but forward, stepping into the flow of the day with a pace that no longer carried the same certainty as before, but something quieter, something more aware, and as he moved, the sounds of the city wrapped around him once again, familiar, constant, yet no longer unnoticed. Back on the sidewalk ahead, Naomi shifted her weight slightly, then took another step forward, her cane tapping lightly against the ground, the sound clear, steady, and James remained beside her for one more step, then another, until the rhythm of their movement became indistinguishable from the rhythm of the city itself. And without needing to say anything more, without needing to look back, they continued on, their figures gradually blending into the morning light, into the movement of people, into the quiet continuation of a day that had been altered in ways that could not be measured by distance or time alone. The street behind them carried no trace of what had happened, no mark, no sign, no sound of the moment that had once stopped everything. But it did not need to, because what mattered had already moved beyond it, carried forward in the quiet understanding that had taken its place. And as the sunlight stretched across the pavement, soft and steady, the world did not change all at once. It changed in small, unseen ways, in the spaces between actions, in the moments that followed, in the choices that came next. And Naomi Walker walked on, not because the path was clear, but because she had always known how to move forward even when it was not. And that was something no one could take from her, not then, not now, not ever.